Okay.
Great. Well, good morning. Hello and welcome everyone to our Sunday Forum series as we continue this series on the exile. I am, of course, Edwin Weber, one of the pastors at St. Mark's, and so glad everybody is able to join me today for this. Over the past several months, we've looked at the exile in many different ways. Including from the prophets perspective of the prophets. And I'm really happy about this because we've done 2 sessions on Jeremiah, 2 sessions on Ezekiel, and now we are rounding out the big 3, so to speak. Today we are starting the first of our 2 sessions in attention to the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah is a book which has long been understood to speak to 3 different contexts or periods of time in relationship to this: before exile, during exile, and after exile, which makes the book of Isaiah very unique for us in that we get sort of 3 distinct sort of context in relationship to this. So the first 39 chapters of Isaiah speak most clearly to a people who lived in the land sometime before the exile occurs. It speaks to the historical conflicts among the great nations at the time during Isaiah's day. And most pointedly, it speaks words of judgment and words of warning to all those who would defy God's sovereign reign. And this includes God's own people. Now, the tone of Isaiah dramatically shifts in chapter 40. From 40 to 55, we would call that second Isaiah. That's the middle section. It shifts away from judgment and towards consolation. Words of judgment are still spoken, but they are reserved for the nations who have oppressed God's people. Now, the prophet only has words of consolation and comfort for God's people. Now we can understand God's people as living in exile, living in this foreign land. The prophet, God gives through the prophet promises that God is soon going to restore them. God's going to set them free. God's going to allow them to return to their homeland. The prophet imagines this restoration as being something that it's going to set all things right. And the language that's used is really over the top. Mountains are going to be laid low. The streams are going to gush forth in the desert. A highway is going to be made so that you can go straight back to the land. And honestly, it gives us an impression, it gives us a vision of God's eschatological glory, the glory of God in the end days when the kingdom is fully realized. Now, the final section of Isaiah, Isaiah 56 through 60, 65 it is, I can't quite remember that last section of Isaiah. It speaks to the final audience, final context, and this is the people that have been restored to the land. But the grand promises of the prophet that speak of glory and plenty upon the people's return has yet to be fulfilled. Ruined cities, ruins do not become cities overnight. There were many challenges that God's people still face. Restoration is not a final destination, but a waypoint on the continual work of God who is working to make all things new. Again, these 3 different contexts of the audience of Isaiah before exile, during exile, and after exile is actually given rise to an academic exploration of these ideas that perhaps the book of Isaiah was not entirely written by the historic 8th century BCE prophet. Many of the oracles in the first 39 chapters do speak clearly to the context of Isaiah's day. But the traditional assertion that Isaiah penned the remaining chapters through, given this kind of prophetic vision, it's just that. it's a tradition. Chapters 40 through 65, they do not claim any authorship. In fact, Isaiah isn't even mentioned by name after chapter 39. Nor do any aspect of how the revelation came to the prophet. There is no, statement of this vision. It's just presented this way. This tone shift in chapter 40. Now, perhaps the whole book of Isaiah may represent a school of prophetic thought, which was started by the prophet Isaiah and carried generation by generation over the years until this prophet's book came into the form that we have today. But we don't know this for absolute fact. It's a conjecture, maybe a good one, but a conjecture nonetheless. So I'm not going to be presenting a perspective today or next week that can only be considered through a traditional or a contemporary understanding of the authorship of the book. And my hope for you is that you can perhaps embrace the possibility, at least, of both things being possible. I think more things can maybe be illuminated for us as we interpret the whole book of Isaiah together, if we do that. After all, the precise origins of the book may not matter to us quite so much as this context and how it comes to us, bearing witness to this time before, during, and after exile. Now, to understand the full breadth of Isaiah, we do have to start with a historical figure, the prophet, who was engaged in this ministry in Judea during the 8th century. Isaiah's lifetime was dominated by great tensions in his world. There were tensions between the great nations that surrounded Judea, and Judea was often sort of caught in the middle of these great conflicts between these great nations. There was also a tension between the secular and the sacred, between the prophet and the king. Isaiah's story is told in part in the book of Kings, which you may know is the second volume of the two-part work starting with Samuel. So you have Samuel and Kings, and they present this conflict throughout its pages, this vision of conflict and tension in this period of history between the kings and the prophets. Now, Isaiah's ministry would be dominated by this reality. They are completely inescapable for him, both the wars among the nations and the tension between king and prophet, between the secular and the sacred. And so when we pick up Isaiah, when we pick up this book, we are jumping right into the middle of the stream of this conflict. And so it can be kind of jarring. It doesn't, there's no introduction to these concepts when we pick up Isaiah. And as many of the prophets do, Isaiah doesn't mince words. So we get some pretty strong words starting straight out. Now, Isaiah 6 tells the story of the prophet's call. Isaiah is given a vision. He sees the heavenly temple. There, God is enthroned in splendor. Seraphim attend to God's presence, and they sing praises that are so loud that the foundations shake. And Isaiah is stricken with woe, for he says that he is not ritually pure to behold the divine. And he fears that he's going to die as a result. But a seraph takes a coal from the altar and touches Isaiah's lips with it. The purifying fire cleansing him of impurity and giving him the authority to speak God's word. Now, this whole scene is prefaced with a prepositional phrase. The story in chapter 6 begins in the year King Uzziah died. And I find this really interesting because Isaiah's call, that moment of first beholding the true splendor of God, King of the universe, is contrasted by the limitations and shortcomings of the kings in Isaiah's day. Um, so you kind of this idea, all the splendor and majesty of God, the true splendor, contrasted to this earthly king in the same year that he died. It's how the story is framed. Now, many of the kings were not very good, maybe not very particularly noteworthy. I can't really tell you anything about King Uzziah other than the fact that the year he died was the year that God issued the call to Isaiah. Now, other kings were plenty bad. Some of the depraved and wicked kings lived during Isaiah's time as well. So we can kind of imagine the prophet longing for something else. And Isaiah chapter 11 is an oracle that is all about a just and good king, and is an expression how Isaiah longs for a righteous king, a just king who would reign with divine equity and truth. Now, Isaiah's image of this king is that this king would establish Judah's place among the nation. And by being sort of this light on the hill, a beacon to all people, that all nations would be drawn to God through Judea. Now, Isaiah saw many kings come and go, many of them pretty bad. But one day he finally saw a king that he thought might actually be the king that he longed for. A political leader that would stand for righteousness and justice and faithfulness. And so King Hezekiah had big shoes to fill, I would say. And I suspect that his mentor, Isaiah, really never let him forget it. And maybe that was too much pressure. Maybe it was all too much, more than one human could bear, this idea to restore the whole nation to greatness. Or maybe Hezekiah thought that there were just limitations, practical limitations on what he could actually do. Now, a lot of Hezekiah's story in the Bible is centered on the fact that Hezekiah secures a victory by God's intervention. Hezekiah secures victory over Assyria. But what's interesting and most telling in this context, when we're talking about exile, is that when the clouds gather on the horizon, warning of war with Babylon, Hezekiah actually ignores them. There's an interesting story told in Isaiah 39 where a group of envoys come from Babylon. They come to Jerusalem. They come because they have heard King Hezekiah was sick. And in fact, Hezekiah almost dies in the chapter before. And shall we say their appearance is suspicious? They are coming very soon after this nearly fatal illness of the king. And almost seems like they were there to kind of assess the political situation, kind of suss out any political weaknesses after Hezekiah's close call. Now, Hezekiah is a gracious host. He gives them grand hospitality. He shows the envoys the splendor of his house. He even takes them into the treasury of the nation to show off the wealth and splendor of the nation. Maybe not the smartest thing to do. So Isaiah comes to Hezekiah and confronts him about this misstep. He warns Hezekiah that the Babylons want nothing more than to conquer. And showing off the splendor of your house has just given them the excuse they were looking for, Isaiah says that one day everything in Hezekiah's house will be taken by Babylon. His line ended, and the destruction of the nation. Isaiah prophesies exile directly to the king of the nation. And Hezekiah basically ignores Isaiah. It's stunning. It really is. He says he's not concerned because he knows the evil things that will happen, they won't happen in his day. He will be dead and buried when they transpire. So what does it matter to him? Now, this must have been incredibly disheartening to Isaiah. Isaiah, who finally gets his vision of coming exile, right? And all these years of longing for a good king all of his life, he thinks he finally has found this king, only to have his hopes dashed yet again when the warnings of exile are ignored by Hezekiah. Isaiah does warn. He gives the warning to the person who he had longed for to be a just and good king. And Hezekiah does not rise to the occasion. Even the best earthly rulers, at least in Isaiah's mind, fall short. And this forms a key perspective of Isaiah on the exile, which is that there are warnings. The warnings are given to the leaders, the ones who can do something about it. But it was easier to do nothing rather than, even though the result was untold suffering and pain, it was easier simply to do nothing. So I pose a few rhetorical questions for us to think about and consider. How often are the warnings of crisis are given but are too easily ignored? When the prophetic voices of today, whomever those prophetic voices might be, when they speak today, do we listen or do we care? Are there things that we choose not to worry about because we think they won't affect us, all the while ignoring the ways they will affect our neighbor and our children and grandchildren? Now, here is where we have the big shift, right? Hezekiah's big disappointment. That's where 39 in the very next chapter, it forms this linchpin, shifting. 39 ends with warning and denial. Chapter 40 starts with comfort, and the people are now living in exile. What's perhaps interesting to me is that Isaiah never has an "I told you so" moment. That would be so tempting for us as humans, right? Isaiah never delights in his self-righteousness or the accuracy of his prophecy. There's no gloating. Instead, Isaiah shifts in tone so dramatically, immediately, from warnings of judgment directly to comfort and consolation. God's hammer may fall hard, the consequences of our unfaithfulness severe, but the message of Isaiah is that God relents from punishing, comforts those in pain, gives hope to those who long for a change, and promises that God will return them to their land. The first image of exile we get in chapter 40 is a punitive one, this notion of punishment, where God says that Jerusalem's term, like a prison term, if you will, Jerusalem's term has been served, her penalty paid double for all her sins. So you can kind of imagine a prisoner being given a 5-year term, but they actually end up serving a 10-year term. And this doubling is something interesting because it would imply that God's people have gotten more punishment than they deserved. And that is indeed the perspective of Isaiah. I wonder, in our experience of exile, do we feel like we have received more punitive measures than we have deserved? The perspective of Isaiah here in this middle in chapter 47, now in 2nd Isaiah, there are words of judgment, severe words of judgment spoken over Babylon. And her sin, Babylon's sin, is named in part as being she was overzealous with her role as being the tool of God's judgment. The prophet uses this concept. She calls her daughter Babylon, daughter Chaldea. Her sins are also named as being certain that Babylon's place is to be secure forever, that Babylon won't face the same consequences of conquest and empire. Their cruelty was born out of a misguided impression that this can't ever happen to us. Well, it does happen to Babylon. The wheels of time turn, seasons change, and the new burgeoning empire of Persia threatens now to do to Babylon what she had done countless times before, including to God's people. Now, if you've been with me through some of my Thursday evening Bible studies, you know I don't like to talk a lot about the political machinations and all this stuff that are going on. But the perspective of Isaiah is that all of these things that are happening, the political, the secular, what's happening in the world, they all have a purpose in relationship to God's divine will. Just as God used Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon as tools of judgment against the Israelites, so now God uses Cyrus and Persia as tools of judgment against Babylon. But what's interesting is that they are not just tools of judgment, but they are also the means of salvation and liberation for the Israelites. It is God who does this. God uses a common means, and by that I mean secular, worldly, political means. But it is God who is doing this. In earlier parts of the book, the prophet, expresses this longing for a just, good king to emerge, and that seems to be ultimately thwarted. But now, this new Cyrus, this new king, might live into this. Maybe, just maybe. Cyrus is a tool by which God will restore Israel, but he is just a king. The focus now is on God, who remains all powerful and all sovereign. So much of Isaiah's perspective on exile speaks in part to who's going to rescue God's people, who's going to lead them out, if you will, who is going to be their Messiah, who's going to save them. And we can apply that to ourselves. Who is our Messiah? Who is going to save us? Where we choose to place our ultimate trust is of utmost importance because it reveals to us who we think or who we want to think or what is divine. Who or what is divine to us. Isaiah's perspective on exile is that kings come and go, empires rise and fall, and the means and ways of earthly salvation and peace, they may be very present or they may seem far off. But regardless, God remains in power. God remains steadfast. And God will work a new thing, work in a new way, even in the midst of exile, to bring about restoration and peace. Now, if it is God who is steadfast, unmovable, and truly sovereign, why should we place our trust in anything or anyone else? Isaiah tries to show us that the other powers of this world are but cheap imitations of God's true divine power. And those who do wield that power, they do so at God's behest and for God's purpose. We may take delight in human ingenuity, place our trust in current political leaders, rest in the certainty that the nations will always provide stability, build up barns of wealth to protect us from uncertainty, and erect whatever other idol of our faith we might like. But whatever we put in place of God, it's never going to fill that void. God belongs there in our life. It is God who is in power, God who is ultimately in control, and we can't come out of exile by any other means.